right, my name's Corey Washington.
And I'm Steve Hsu, and this is our show, Manifold.
And Steve, we just had a great conversation with a fabulous young woman named Noor Siddiqui, who you first met a few months ago. Tell us about that.
So Noor is the founder of an event at Stanford called No Filter. And it's an event where the students invite interesting people to give them unfiltered conversations and discussions about all kinds of topics. Noor is extremely interesting. She was a Thiel Fellow. Thiel Fellows are people who are funded by Peter Thiel to start a company right out of high school, which she did, but now she's at Stanford University. And we had an excellent conversation with her. She's very special in a number of ways. We wanted, I think in our very first discussion, episode 0, we talk about how old and out of touch we are. And
as if it's not obvious.
Yeah. And so, of course, we'd like to get some millennial or Gen Z kind of people in to give us a feel for what life is like for that generation. And so we kind of killed two birds with one stone with Noor because she's Gen Z millennial, but she's also in the heart of Silicon Valley. She's now an experienced startup entrepreneur. And so she can talk about both those topics, which are things that you and I are both interested in.
And I think we learned a lot about what Stanford's like today. You know, I was there at Stanford. I think I left Stanford around 1992, which is just before essentially the internet blew up and Stanford became the center of startup universe. At least the Silicon Valley did. But she had some really interesting perspectives on how college differed from the time when we were there.
Now, we recorded over the internet because with Corey, I think Corey was in the office and I was at home. And this was because we had this polar vortex event in the Midwest where it was incredibly cold. And they actually shut down the university for several days, which is very unusual for Michigan State University. So the audio quality might not be up to what we aspire to get in these shows, but I think it's still listenable. And unless you have more to say, let's just go into the interview. Corey, we're live now with Noor Siddiqui. She's an undergraduate at Stanford University. One of those super talented kids that when you meet them, you sort of feel like they're going to do something really interesting in life. So first, could you tell us a little bit about your background, how you ended up going to Stanford, what the college application process was like? We hear so much about how stressful it is compared to when we were kids.
Yes, I think I probably have a little bit of a weirder story. So when I was graduating from high school, I found out about the Thiel Fellowship and sort of, dropped all my ambitions for college and sort of thought that, okay, if I can learn how to, start a company and sort of quote unquote change the world, that's really, what I wanted to accomplish from college anyways. So I should go do that. I basically, decided to do the Thiel Fellowship right out of high school. Started a company, and then there was basically this decision point where, okay, you can either go try and sell this company, or you can go to college. And I think where I was is that I felt really proud that I had sort of built this product, built this team, went from sort of nothing to something. But at the same time, what I was working on isn't what I wanted my life's work to be. It was sort of like we had built this physician collaboration tool that was helping doctors and it was live inpatient care, but it wasn't necessarily like the thing I wanted to be my life's work. And I thought that, okay, you learn some really valuable things here, but if you think really long term, it probably makes more sense for you to go to school and study computer science and genetics, like the things that you've always been really excited about, and to try and do something a little bit bigger than sort of like just a digital health app, which is kind of the thing that I had been working on before. So that's sort of the point where I went to Stanford. So I actually am sort of like 3 years removed from, most of the cohort. But of course, at Stanford, you actually do have a lot of people like me where they sort of did something else, they took a gap year, or they also did a company and either decided to sell it or not sell it and then come to school, or, they were in the military, or a lot of people have sort of like interesting stories. They went to the Olympics or whatever, and then decided to come to college after that.
Great. I had totally forgotten that you were a Thiel Fellow. So, Corey, looks like
I want to hop in for a little bit and roll back a little bit. I want to know, can I ask the most basic questions about a couple of things? Can you tell me where you're from? Because you sound like you have kind of a really interesting outlook, and I'm kind of curious. Where did you go to high school, and what were your interests there, and how did you find out the Thiel Fellows? And for I think a lot of people, a basic question is, what are the Thiel Fellows? So can we roll back a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. So I grew up in the suburbs of Washington D.C. So in Fairfax County, Virginia, and pretty much everyone who ends up at Stanford goes to Thomas Jefferson, which is sort of like the science and tech magnet school. But I actually went to Robinson Secondary, which is sort of like a like IB school, and I was really excited about sort of going to school internationally at the time. So I chose to go to Robinson. So yeah, that's where I grew up. And then what was your second question? How did I find out about the Thiel Fellowship?
And what are the Thiel Fellows? I think many people don't quite know. Steve and I know about it. We want to make sure everyone is in on the conversation.
Oh, sure. So yeah, I found out about the Thiel Fellowship actually kind of just online. There was just sort of little snippets of stories here and there that I saw, and just kind of the first story that I found, I was just, got really excited about it. What are the Thiel Fellows? So the Thiel Fellows are a program that was started by Peter Thiel in 2011, and the idea was let's give young people grants so that they can go pursue whatever ambitious dream they have. And as a condition of this grant, you forego university for at least 2 years while you try and make whatever your vision is come to life.
And as I recall, Peter Thiel started this with a slightly subversive agenda, right? And Peter really had some doubts about the value of a college education relative to the value of getting real-world experience. I mean, Steve, you know Peter pretty well. Wasn't the idea somehow that he thought that this was actually a more valuable experience often than 4 years of college?
So I think Peter and many people in his orbit, including a little bit myself, think that we're in the midst of potentially a higher ed bubble in a certain sense. And so, yes, he had a slightly subversive view of this. The place where I agree with him is for some super talented people, this might make sense. I think for the average kid, it doesn't make that much sense. But I would love to hear what Noor has to say about it.
Yeah, I mean, in my opinion, I think that his agenda has been sensationalized a little bit. I think there's really a lot of value to what he's saying, which is that there are alternative paths to success, and it doesn't have to be predicated on a degree, whether it's from a very fancy institution like Stanford or Harvard, or whether it's from any other university. And I think that there's really, I think for someone coming out of high school, that option is not really presented. But at least especially I think in 2011, 2012, when this first started, the idea of not going to college, I think, was a lot crazier than it is now. I think even now, if you look at the fellowship applicants that are coming in, a lot of them have been working on their startup for several years. They've already gotten funding. They already have traction. They're basically much farther along, I think, in part because of seeing the previous class of fellows, sort of what they accomplished. So I think, especially in 2012, there wasn't seen as any other avenue to be successful or like to make anything of yourself besides going to college. And I think that even since then, there's been a little bit of a change where, you see more people kind of like going after apprenticeships or going after, an idea they have and trying to like build a business just right out of high school. And that wasn't as much of a thing just a few years earlier.
It's interesting. My cousin's kid, I guess that's my first cousin once removed. She similarly, she left high school, didn't go to college, started up a catering business in Atlanta, and just crossed the 1 million mark for grossing last year. And her take on it is, if you're kind of a self-learner and a self-starter, then that's the kind of person who could also succeed without college. And I think she's pretty much planning to hold on to that path.
Noor, when you applied for the Thiel Fellowship, had you already been admitted to Stanford, or did you have to reapply later?
Yeah, so Stanford basically let me defer for several years. They were very kind, but basically by the time that I actually joined Stanford, I think they were unwilling to let me defer anymore. But they let me defer for the time between high school and the fellowship.
So you did go through the standard college application process. You weren't sure that you were going to be a Thiel Fellow, and so you applied to Stanford through the regular process?
Well, I mean, all the applications are sort of due at the same time. It's been a little bit of a while since all of that happened, but yeah, I think the college applications are due in December or something, and I think that I was applying to the fellowship and university all at the same time.
So if you're a parent like me of teenagers, my kids just turned 13 not so long ago. You get the impression that the really serious families are sort of planning already, like what their kids are going to do to pad out their applications to get into a place like Stanford. Is that consistent with your experience? I mean, is it taken that seriously these days?
I think it depends where you grow up. But yeah, I think that the process of getting into college is probably more stressful than it needs to be. I think there's probably way more posturing than there needs to be. And I think that's also, I think, where Peter has a good point, where, you shouldn't be spending, 18 years of your, until your adult life sort of like padding a resume and not really pursuing your real interests. And I think that the irony of the whole thing is that I think, at least in my experience, the people who actually get in, they didn't spend most of their time padding their resume and working on things artificially. They sort of spent their time going really deep on things that they sincerely cared about. And I think when you sincerely care about something, maybe more comes of it. But maybe if you have a tiger parent, they can really drive you as well. I don't know, because I fall very much into the former category. My parents were actually like quite hands off. They were never really like pushing me, either to like get good grades or to do extracurriculars or anything like that. So I feel, I guess, fortunate in that way. But at the same time, I actually sort of envy the tiger parents. I think it's kind of cool. Like my cousins, actually, their parents are, I think, sort of more tigery. They sort of like take them to Japanese classes and like go to Japan and do Japanese immersion and things like that. While my parents were like very unwilling to sort of like let me go anywhere during the summer. They wanted me to sort of like spend as much time with them and with family as possible.
Yeah, I'd say I'm kind of borderline tiger aware of what these people are up to. And my feeling is that, the admissions people would love to see a kid who is truly passionate. And if there's something on their resume that, really stands out, it's something the kid really was passionate about and wasn't manufactured by some adults, dragging them to Japanese class or something like that. But the problem for them is that they can't really tell the difference. It's very tough for them to know whether it was true passion, which is what they're trying to detect, or something meant to simulate that in the application.
Yeah, I think it's very clear sort of once they're in college, which it was, because I think the people who were driven by their parents, they sort of relax and aren't really very motivated anymore, or are still sort of more motivated by kind of impressing their parents or, impressing some outside party. But I think that the students that are internally driven, they're, kind of in overdrive. They're sort of in the place where they had always wanted to be, or the place where they have sort of like the most access to the opportunities that they had sort of been wanting for a very long time, and the freedom as well to pursue them. So I think it becomes very clear once they're admitted. But yeah, I agree. I think that as someone who's in admissions, it's probably really hard to differentiate between the person that was very well coached and the person that has more sincere drive.
One of the things
sorry, Steve.
Oh, go ahead. Well, one of the things I argue with my wife about is the musical instrument stuff, because I was forced to learn to play the piano when I was a kid and kind of hated it and have no musical talent, but, did pretty well in piano competitions for some weird reason. But I remember like at the time when I was at Harvard or something, there were tons of Asian American kids who had done like 12 years of violin and piano and won all these competitions, but then they never touched the instrument again. And I feel like that was just the perfect example of that kind of maybe overgrown tiger parenting.
Yeah. No, yeah. I've definitely met a lot of people like that who sort of, they won these like math competitions or science competitions. I forget the names of them, but they're very prestigious, and they sort of never touch the subject to get after it because they're sort of tired of it. But I also wonder whether, even if you decide not to touch it again, the instrument or the math or the science, biology, facts, whatever it is, I wonder whether that discipline still sort of stays with you. I think that to me it seems like it might be valuable. Oh, I was going to say, to me it seems like it might be valuable anyways, but that's again because I sort of, looking back, I have this like weird desire to, have had that like slightly more of that experience that I actually did.
So the extent to which I supported the forcing kids to learn to play a musical instrument was because I thought early on maybe there's actually something about their brain development that's actually assisted by learning to play the instrument or learning to coordinate their hands. But then after a certain point, it seemed to be that it would, at this point it's just grinding. And if they don't like it, then don't make them do it. And so that's sort of where I dropped out of the tiger parent mode. But I still am. My wife is still angry at me for not supporting her more on this one.
There's actually research that kind of supports these views about encouraging things. There's some studies on creativity which show that if you basically take a kid and pay them, you have to set up a competition, right, where kids are asked to make a drawing or to build something out of construction materials, and you pay the one who produces the best drawing, judged by some particular method or experts. Those kids basically, if you give the option of playing with those materials again, they won't touch them in the next hour or so. But if kids are allowed to more or less free play with them as they like, and then maybe you select the best ones, those kids will often continue to play with those things for hours on end. But putting kids in competitive setting and really encouraging them to do something seems to discourage later activity, at least over the short term in these studies. So it may be true in longer terms also. I'm kind of extreme. I'm forcing my kid to learn like 4 different languages, and she's 3. And, so far she's going along with it. I'm in the opposite position. My wife is sort of less enthusiastic about this than I am. But the kid seems okay with it so far. I'm expecting a backlash at some point in time in the future. I want to get 4 or 5 languages under the hood before she stops willing to play along.
Let me go back to you, Noor, and let me ask you, when you look back at your startup experience as a Thiel Fellow, do you ever think back to that time and say, wow, how naive I was? It's crazy to think I could have done, started a company when I was 18 or something like this. Or do you have the view that, no, it was perfectly reasonable and actually could have succeeded?
Oh, sorry. I guess I make it sound like it was worse than it was. So, yeah, I definitely look back at myself and think that I was very naive back then. But I think that hopefully at any checkpoint 5 years later, I will always think that about myself 5 years ago, because I think slope is more important than y-intercept. It matters, how much you're growing every year, not, where you start. So I think that hopefully I'll always think that way about my 5 year ago self. But no, I think it's totally reasonable to be successful at that age, or really at any age. I think it's more an internal decision than an external decision about when you're going to take yourself seriously and when you're going to take your own ideas seriously. I actually consider, the experience, 100% of success. I learned how to build a product, learned how to build a team, learned how to raise money. Not very many startups get to actually make money. And, we were able to get to that point. And, there was interest in people who wanted to buy the company. I think the only reason why it wasn't sort of wrapped up in the traditional, quote, like success package was because, we chose not to go through with the acquisition because I wanted to, go to university instead of, get it acquired. But I think, again, that badge is not closed to me in any sense. I feel like, after I graduate, if I want to go do it again, there's, I don't think any of the investors or people that I know would think oh, you were not allowed to go back to school after you made the commitment to start the company. I think that everyone has their own circumstances and makes decisions that make sense for them. And I think for me, I wanted to think a little bit more long term than this like very immediate exit from something that I worked on for 2 years.
So Noor, sorry to interrupt, but can you tell me what the app did?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So what we did is we connected primary care doctors with specialists. So basically, you go into a primary care doctor's office instead of waiting 5 or 6 weeks to see a dermatologist or a cardiologist or orthopedic surgeon. It just allowed you to consult right away with that specialist in one office visit. So basically, the benefit there is that instead of going to the orthopedic surgeon and him or her telling you that, oh, you actually only need physical therapy, I can't operate on you, you sort of get that consult much earlier so that you can be directed to the right next steps, whether that's physical therapy or the right imaging or the right medication. It all happens in one visit instead of spread out over several visits.
Are you by any chance familiar with a company in the UK called Babylon Health?
I'm actually not.
So, your idea is so great that it's actually something very similar to it is succeeding like crazy in the UK right now. There's a company called Babylon Health that has an app-driven general practitioner access, and it's actually they kind of went through a loophole, and so they are part of the national healthcare system. And so anyone in the London area can select them as their GP, general practitioner, and the contact with the physician happens over the phone, video app. There's a triage process where you kind of inform a chatbot about your symptoms or what your problems are, and it actually does some initial triage using AI. And I think 500,000 people have signed up for this service already, and including the health minister of the UK. So it seems to me like a really obvious use of the technology that makes the the waiting times smaller, and I think in many cases just talking to your physician over a chat app, video chat app, is just as good as what you get after sitting in a waiting room for an hour.
Yeah, so I mean, the main difference from just like typical telemedicine, you're at home seeing a doctor, to what we were doing is that we actually had the primary care doctor there with you. So basically, they're assessing you in person, and then if they need a specialist for some specific concern you have, instead of having to go to that specialist visit alone without the proper context or the right imaging or whatever steps beforehand, you kind of got that with the doctor there with you. But I mean, I think that the problem in the U.S. is not a lack of technology or a lack of options. I think it's much more a lack of incentive. The reason why you don't see technology like this adopted across healthcare has much more to do with payment schemes, right? I mean, Kaiser has products like this because they're bearing risk, right? They're responsible for the cost of the patient. But if you're not bearing risk, which is happening in most settings in healthcare today, there's not really an incentive for you to try and make things more efficient and to save people time. And I think that in the UK, you do have, sort of like more of a single payer system going on. So there's more of an incentive to try and reduce costs.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, the U.S. is going to be slower, I think, in implementing a lot of important innovations, just because aligning the payers with, incentives from the payers to the actual people who deliver the medicine it's just messed up right now. And maybe will be messed up for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really sad because there's so many people here who are building really exciting things, and now when people ask me about, oh, should I start this healthcare company or that healthcare company, like the first question I ask them is like, okay, well, who's paying you? Are you sure they will pay you? Because I think there's like an assumption, basically, every other industry where, okay, if I provide value to this person, they're going to be willing to pay me. But the problem in healthcare is like you can provide value to the doctor, to the patient, but they're not the one who's actually paying you, right? You have to convince an insurer, or you have to convince, a self-insured company, or you have to convince, some other party that's like very bureaucratic or has very different incentives than, trying to solve, a specific actor's specific problem. So I think that just makes things really complicated. And I think that a lot of startups don't realize that until very late. And that's sort of why you see a lot of these direct-to-consumer companies like, Doctor on Demand, for example, who sort of pivot from, direct-to-consumer to selling to self-insured companies, because they just realize that there's not a willingness to pay from the consumer, because they're getting their health insurance from where they work or from the government, or they're not paying out of pocket for it.
Yeah, I agree with your characterization of our system completely. I mean, I think some of the single payer systems, ironically, because you would think that we have unfettered capitalism, but in fact, a lot of these innovations are going to get rolled out faster in the single payer systems than here.
Yeah, I know. Well, a lot of these results are very not intuitive. It sort of reminds me of like, Econ 101. It's like just within that first class, you sort of see, okay, wow, very small, changes to incentive structures cause like crazy downstream effects. And I think that that's what you're seeing in healthcare. I mean, I think one of the stats I was really shocked by is that if you go to sort of like any doctor's office and you ask, what percentage of the bill is absorbed by like the actual process of billing, it's 30%. Like 30% of what they make is actually, it costs them 30% to just do the billing process. So it's like on every
white collar.
Yeah, on every $100. Yeah. So and every $100 they make, $30 is being spent just like capturing the billing, right? Just like sending in the forms, dealing with insurance, just like getting the reimbursement. I mean, that's just it's a huge waste of money. It wastes a lot of people's time.
You talk to any doctors and they'll complain about that right off the bat. Right? The amount of paperwork they have to do to basically justify their billing is just enormous and a huge waste of their time. It's there's definitely some efficiencies that can be gained there in healthcare if someone figures out a way to alleviate that burden.
But here we're really, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that, I mean, most people thought that this move to, electronic health records was, a move forward, digitizing health, all that. But I think fewer people realized that the move to Epic was really about billing. Epic is really a billing system. It's not something that helps, keep better track of patients.
Yeah, the inefficiency of our billing system, it's apparent to anybody who's been through a complicated medical situation in the US. But in talking about these incentive issues and the rollout of new technology, you're really talking about innovation that is super important for moving things forward into the future. And there, the specific stuff that I'm working on now, which is, prediction of risk from genotype, we're at the point now where we have these predictors which are well validated. They work well. You can pick out the 1% of the population that's most at risk for heart attack or something. But what we're seeing is that the single payer systems, like in Finland or the UK, are probably going to roll all of this stuff out much faster than America. It's just the craziest situation.
Yeah, I mean, even with projects that I've worked on at Stanford. So, for example, in Sebastian Thorn's lab, we worked on a skin classifier. So I specifically worked on something for inflammatory diseases, so like rosacea, psoriasis, eczema, and a bunch of STDs. So basically the way that it works is you just input an image and then, we just have this, CNN that's able to, convolutional neural network that's able to classify that skin lesion at the level of a board certified dermatologist. And we had conversations with, the FDA here, and there's sort of like this very long, dragged out process to try and get this approved for use here. And in Singapore, it's a much shorter process. There was a lot more interest in sort of just deploying it, gathering data, and just using it to help give more people diagnosis sooner for their skin issues. So again, it's like something that could save a lot of money, could save a lot of people time, and because of just issues and how incentives work in the U.S. and how regulation works in the U.S., it's actually going to be deployed outside the U.S. first.
So let me go back to your college experience. So I guess I did my first startup much later in life than you, but one of the things I said afterwards was that even if we hadn't made out well financially, it would have been a fantastic educational experience, and I felt like I had earned the equivalent of like 10x times an MBA because I had done all these things. I actually supervised MBAs and negotiated contracts or raised money or fired people, hired people, all those things. So I'm curious for you now, I guess you're probably what you're on the lookout for getting from your undergraduate experience is quite different because you've already done that. You've already actually founded a company and run it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for me, what I was trying to get out of college was much more like, I guess, research experience. I thought that, having the time to research in the way that you are in, the AI lab at Stanford is very different than what you're allowed to do in industry. So that's kind of what I focus on. I focus more on research things and I guess like just sort of like math and CS classes that I thought, okay, this is really interesting and fun to know and a good way to sort of like, push-ups for your brain, I guess, kind of thing. But yeah, I wasn't really as interested in sort of like the startup classes that they have at Stanford because, I think that that's the kind of thing that you can get a good primer for, like sort of what to expect and kind of what the inflection point should be. But again, I think that it's something that you much more have to live through and sort of like really put your heart into than something that you can get only like 20 hours or 10 hours a week.
So a few years ago, someone told me that every year about 1,000 students at Stanford, including graduate students though, take the machine learning classes or class. Is that still the case, or was that kind of a fad that persisted for a few years and dropped off?
No, I think that the AI classes are still really hot right now. I mean, I don't know if it's at 1,000 people, but I would say it's probably closing in on that number. I mean, they're extremely well taught. I think they're, For me, actually, the way that I've been choosing classes has a lot to do with just how well taught the material is, or like how entertaining the professor is. So, yeah, I think that those classes are very well done. I mean, you can go to like cs231n.stanford.edu and sort of see the class notes. And I think that if you compare that to sort of just like a typical textbook, I think that you can get up to speed a lot faster. Just they have like great illustrations and like great explanations. So yeah, I think that they're well done and they sort of deserve the attendance that they're getting.
So I feel like at Stanford there must be just an incredible diversity in life goals or life aims among the students. So probably there's some fraction of kids who are aiming at an ivory tower academic career, maybe even in the humanities. There's some people that are trying to be billionaires by the time they're 30, and everything in between. Do you guys get that impression? Do you talk about those kinds of things?
So I think one sort of maybe unfortunate factor is that I think that I've probably been sort of too embedded in the sort of like CS or EE community than sort of being well-rounded and knowing everyone. So I think that unfortunately I haven't really gotten to talk too deeply with people outside of CS. But I think that that's definitely true. There are people with, like very different ambitions, and I think that most people certainly do not come here with the ambition to do a startup or to do a company. I think most people, I mean, that's something that you sort of get once you come here. Is you realize that that's sort of a common path if you're in the Bay Area, but it's definitely not. I think the ambition that the majority or even a large fraction of people come in with.
Interesting. So if I heard you properly, you said most of the kids when they enter Stanford are not thinking that they would start or be part of a startup, but they might get exposed to it. And so that number would go up after spending time in the Bay Area.
That's my impression. But again, I mean, I'm just one person. I haven't sort of surveyed everyone and, know exactly what they're thinking in their hearts. But that's sort of the impression that I got. I think that, if you're deciding whether to go to, an East Coast school or a West Coast school, I think that maybe you would be more likely to choose a West Coast school if that was something that you wanted to be exposed to. So maybe it's, the population is going to be enriched for people who want to do that sort of thing. But yeah, I'm not sure.
Noor, had you considered other schools, or did you start at Stanford pretty much right off the bat and go early decision?
No, I wasn't early decision to Stanford, but I think, after the fellowship, I definitely realized that I wanted to stay in the Bay Area, and I, really loved a lot of the people that I met and the network that I made, and I didn't want to kind of be on the East Coast or abroad or someplace far away. I knew I would be really engrossed in school when I was in school, but I still, have been able to go to a lot of things that are, startup-y or healthcare-y or, that are confined to sort of the Bay Area. And yeah, Stanford was the only place I was going to be able to do that as well.
Is that the only place you applied to?
No, I applied to a few other places, but decided not to pursue the deferral of the other places. I mean, I don't think you're even allowed to defer to more than one place anyway.
So I think when we first met, Noor, it was in the Gates, the computer science building, and I think I overheard you and a professor who maybe was your advisor or you work in his lab saying something like, describing a meeting that had just recently happened with some venture capitalists or something, maybe at a cafe, but maybe I just am inventing that part of it. But I was struck by thinking to myself, well, how many places, as an undergraduate? Now, at that time, I guess I had forgotten that you were formerly a Thiel Fellow, but at the time I was struck by saying, like, how many undergraduates are casually discussing with their professor some meeting with a venture capitalist, presumably about a startup or something, a specific funding plan. But is that a common thing at Stanford, or is it only in sort of your narrow circle of friends?
Again, I think it's hard to know what's common or not common because you sort of only live your experience. But I think something I've definitely been really struck by at Stanford, or especially in the Bay Area, is sort of how collaborative the environment was. I mean, I never felt that I wasn't taken seriously, even as a 17-year-old coming out here and starting a company. And that's like very different, I think, than the way that you feel, or at least I felt in high school, where I sort of constantly had to convince, my principal or my teachers to just let me do the things that I wanted to do, versus as soon as I came out here, even, before I had, the Stanford degree, I think that people in the Bay Area are just kind of evaluate you based on, your ideas and what you've executed on, and not really so much on how old you are or what you've done before. And I think that there's also definitely that that vibe, I guess, at Stanford, where if you want to talk to your professor about an idea that you have, and you think it has the potential to become a company, I think that they're surprisingly willing to entertain it and sort of mind melt with you and sort of think about, okay, what are the ways that we can make this happen, or you could make this you could develop this further or test it out in some way.
Yeah, I would say that in the Bay Area, and then also globally in certain places where the startup ecosystem really has taken hold, there is a lot more variability in what people will accept. So some sort of middle-aged venture capitalists would be happy to talk to some really talented young person because they actually have experience with that type of person, really succeeding or creating value. But it is very unusual in the rest of the world. So, if you're on the Michigan State University campus and you're 18 years old, you can't expect anybody, my age to treat you as anything other than, like a freshman or something. So I do think that is very special and very different.
Yeah, I just feel like I've learned so much being treated as a peer by people who are very much not my peers. I definitely recognize that, I'm the same level as, these professors and these people who have decades of experience, but the fact that they treat me that way definitely does, I at least hope, on occasion, I rise to their expectations and, am actually able to, present something at the same level that, they would, if they had thought of, the similar idea or, had a similar ambition in mind.
I think to turn it around, though, if you were a professor at some other university and you were routinely approached by 18-year-old kids with super high confidence, but actually weren't able to actually back it up with some capabilities, then you would rapidly stop treating the modal 18-year-old that approaches you with that kind of level of respect, right? So there's a sort of combination of things. There has to actually be a pool of talented people who are confident enough and can actually do things that are useful in order to create that balance in the ecosystem.
Yeah, I would also say it's bidirectional, though. I feel like I met a lot of students here who have way less confidence than they should. They're actually much smarter than people decades older than them, but they're actually still too caught up in the deference that they were raised in, where they don't want to, take an idea that they have more seriously or take their capabilities more seriously. So it's actually funny. I think that the people who are more confident are actually, I would say on average, a little bit less competent than the ones who are, sort of like more shy and more reserved and like more willing to sort of like jump through the hoop. I actually think very often those people are more competent, but they just don't want, they're just not as willing to put themselves out there or to, I guess, risk being wrong about something, which, everyone inevitably is.
I agree with you. I have as a kind of algorithm running in my head that the quiet guy on the team or the quiet gal, you want to just listen very carefully and give them a little extra space to express what they're thinking, because often they are the most insightful ones, but they just don't happen to be the most extroverted or confident ones.
Obviously, you're a professor, so you've been exposed to, thousands of students in your classrooms, and you probably have like a larger end to sort of see, is that generally what you see in the wild, or is that maybe just a thing, at this one school that I've been at?
Yeah, confidence and capability are, I think, mildly positively correlated, but certainly nowhere near correlation 1. So you can have people who are crazily overconfident and, people who are really quiet, but they can really do stuff. I was just going to say this other thing where you mentioned that, you and your friends probably have noticed that, if like you and Professor X are approaching some de novo topic, you guys might pick it up faster than he or her. In the same way, like when I talk to really big figures like, university president or billionaire, famous billionaire that you might know of, oftentimes they're not necessarily superhuman at all. They're just as confused about the same stuff as other people. And you really just need to treat them as you would anybody else. There isn't any 100% perfect indicator of superhuman ability.
Yeah, I think the one thing that always surprises me is whenever I talk to someone who's, a super expert in one field, and you kind of go a couple degrees to the right or left, it's just very shocking to me how shallow, the understanding can be. And that's sort of humbling in some sense, because even if you are an expert in one thing, you should always like remain curious and remain like willing to learn, because your expertise can only go so far. But yeah, I think that's always something shocking, because I think that you assume that if someone's really competent in one area, they must be competent in all areas. But that's, I think, never been the case. I've always seen that people who are experts in one domain are just as novices as the rest of us in every other domain besides the one that they're an expert in.
Yeah, I think that's the right conclusion to take from that. Expertise is not necessarily always transferable, and oftentimes, for someone to succeed to the point where they are the world-class expert on some, say, area of molecular biology or something, they really had to focus on that, and so their knowledge about the Patriots quarterback is no better, or is actually much worse than the average person. So I think your conclusions based on that experience are correct.
Yeah, that's also something I've been really impressed with at Stanford, is that someone will be, world-class expert in some area, and then they'll teach this class as if it was for two kindergartners, right? They're explaining, how Fourier transforms work in this like third grade way, and I just absolutely love it. I just think that, if you're an expert in something, then you're able to explain something at a, kindergarten level, and it's so clear how well they understand the concept when they're explaining it in just like completely intuitive terms before putting out any of the math. So that's something that I don't think I'm nearly as good as I want to be at, but that's something that I think is probably one of the main takeaways I've gotten from Stanford, is that if you're really technical at something, then you should be able to explain it in completely non-technical terms, and they should still feel like they understand whatever the concept is.
Yeah, I often say this to graduate students, which is that, when someone has a really, really deep knowledge of a particular thing, let's say Fourier transforms, that means they can explain it in a very, very simple way. And they, those kinds of explanations, or those kinds of models or comic book, renderings of what's really going on in there are really priceless gems. And I always tell the grad students, if some visitor is coming to give a talk on X and that they're a deep expert on X, you can go and talk to them, and they might not necessarily be able to do it, but very often they'll be able to explain it to you in a way which is, basically priceless. You're not going to get it from anybody else. And so it's worth trying to dig that out of them when they come and visit.
I think the sign of a really great classic paper is often just seeing how simple and beautiful descriptions of the phenomenon are. The obvious example of this are Einstein's papers. The early parts of them often have no formulas, and they're just driven by these gorgeous thought experiments. And Feynman was much the same way, as Steve, right? His ability to kind of communicate ideas using very, very simple analogies. I think it's really a sign, if someone can't explain something in a very simple, intuitive way, I have deep doubts as to whether they actually understand it.
Yeah, and actually, I would say that in my own research, I always, after a certain point, once I figured this out, I would challenge myself that if I was asked to give a talk on this material, that I could explain it fine. I could boil it down to a very simple explanation, which at the beginning of the talk, maybe the first 15, 20 minutes, that everybody in the audience, even if they weren't an expert, could really understand that first 15 and 20 minutes, and then have some, intuitive understanding of what I was doing. I would say, though, that going to a Feynman lecture is a little bit like eating what people used to say about eating a Chinese meal. Like, it's very satisfying, but then like half an hour later, you're hungry again. And what happens with Feynman is he's such a good showman, and he's so charismatic, and the way he talks is so simple that during the talk you feel like you understand it. But then as you're walking back to your dorm room with the other students, and you try to explain to each other what he said, you realize actually I don't really get it the way Feynman did, because now I can't generalize from the analogies that he gave me. I can easily generalize in a way in which I make a mistake, which he wouldn't necessarily do. But so it is a little bit tricky. It's not always that simple.
Oh yeah, I totally agree. It's just like watching like a gymnast, right? It's like, or a dancer, right? It's like, wow, that looks so easy. It's like, it only looks so easy because it took a decade of preparation. And I think that it's weird. This phenomenon reappears over and over, right? You see it in performers, you see it in professors, the way they present material, and you actually also see it in startups and the way they present companies. If a founder is super clear about the problem they're solving, they're able to explain it to you, in 2 sentences. And so many people never get to that point because they're always in that, that foggy intermediary where they're still rehearsing, they're still refining, they're still practicing, they're still trying to understand, what exactly should their business be doing, what problem should they be solving. Yeah, so it's very weird. It's very weird how whenever you've gained mastery over anything, it ends up being this very effortless and concise summary. It's a very, very consistent endpoint for many different fields, weirdly.
I even find that, if you're the founder and you have a very, very specific and well-formulated explanation of what the company's trying to do and what the problem is and what the market is, that even on your team, if you go one or two layers away from the founders, people on the team can't really articulate properly exactly what problem they're trying to solve or what the company should be trying to do. Or if you meet even the investors, like the VCs, you meet them a year or two after they've invested in the company, maybe at a board meeting, and they're also a little bit fuzzy about exactly what the issues are. And so it's much harder to diffuse that information out than you think. Let me go back to one of the questions I wanted to ask you. This is a little bit now, maybe because it sounds like you're very focused on the sort of engineering, computer science, genomics part of things, but this is a kind of a broader question about the atmosphere on campus. So do you think that free speech is in any way restricted on campus these days? Are there serious ideas that can't get a proper discussion on campus?
Yeah, well, now we're getting into the controversial questions. That's good. I don't know. I think that I've never encountered that issue. I always feel free to speak my mind and, tell my honest opinion about things. But I think that, perhaps if you're, not a minority woman, maybe you don't feel like you can do that because you're somehow infringing on someone else's rights. And I'm not sure, honestly. But I haven't felt that way. I haven't felt like any idea that I present can't be taken and, debated and discussed. But yeah, I would feel bad if other people felt that way, obviously.
Are there things where, as you're asking the question or raising the topic in a discussion, you're thinking to yourself, wow, I am a minority woman, so I can say this, but if I were a white guy, I wouldn't be able to actually bring this up in conversation without taking a big risk? I
mean, that's not something that I think about personally, but I imagine maybe if you were a white male, then you would be maybe treading more carefully. But again, I only inhabit this one body, so I can't really, I can't really know what someone else is thinking. I think it also often comes down to personality. I think just like me as a person, I'm not really concerned with confrontation. Confrontation isn't something that bothers me, and I think that someone else, if you're less willing to engage in debate, then obviously you'd shy away from a lot of topics, regardless of the climate. So yeah, I think that there's always this dual responsibility of the individual and of the community to support that. So I think that any single individual with commensurate strength can sort of break any community, even if you talk about something as oppressive as like a dictatorship, right? You see these individuals who overcome even that level of of muffling and silencing, right? And then we also see the opposite case where it doesn't matter how open the community is, how accepting the community is, if you have an individual that's very, very unwilling to, voice their opinion, then yeah, again, you don't see people expressing ideas openly. So yeah, there's always, I think, a joint responsibility between the individual and the environment that you're in. And I think as an individual, you can only control yourself. So, my choice is always to, feel as free as I want to be and not really let the environment bother me.
So if I were to channel my inner Peter Thiel, or was it the Stanford Review that he worked for? Is that the conservative newspaper on campus?
Yeah, that's correct. He founded the Stanford Review.
Yeah. Okay. So if I were to channel my inner Stanford Review or Peter Thiel, I would say something like, well, things have gotten so politically correct on campus these days that there are quite a few, intellectually defensible, serious questions that deserve, rigorous debate, but you basically can't have those discussions because people on the left will shut you down right away. And I think Michigan State doesn't have this quite so much because we're kind of a land grant, blue collar, down to earth kind of university. But I wonder if you feel that that's true at Stanford at all.
I don't think that's true, but I think it also depends sort of like where you swing on the political spectrum. If you feel like no one supports the opinions that you have and no one wants to come to a talk that you present, then I can see how you'd feel that way. I think there has been attempts to sort of, have discussions about, various topics that are unpopular. And I think that they happen. They're circulated and people know about them, but the attendance is just very low because it's just not, I guess, a defensible opinion in a lot of people's eyes. So, I mean, they're happening on campus, and a certain subset of students are attending them. But I think it would be correct to say that they're unpopular and not very well attended, I guess.
Okay. Now, when Corey and I were in college, which was before you were born, it was the 80s and Ronald Reagan was president. And, when we thought of college 20 or 30 years before when we went to school, we were thinking of the 50s or 60s. And we could point to millions of ways in which the college experience for somebody in the 50s or 60s was totally different from what we were experiencing in the 80s. And I'm curious what you would say about your current college experience. How do you view it as different from what some old guy like me experienced?
I think it's kind of what we touched on earlier, which is that I think that there's a lot more of a collaborative and collegial relationship between students and faculty than I would imagine I would have on the East Coast or maybe 30 years ago. I think that to me, that has been probably the most valuable and unique part of my Stanford experience is the fact that I have gotten to become so close with professors who have done such interesting work both scientifically and professionally, and getting to learn and work with them on equal footing. I think that's definitely really unique. I think that obviously, CS is really different now than it was 30 years ago, right? I mean, AI has been a huge revolution, and people are really interested and excited about the promises that holds. But I think just more broadly, I mean, computers have just gotten much cheaper, much faster, much more ubiquitous. So I think that just the possibilities for what kind of business that you can build, or just what kind of things you can do just with a computer, and not with significant funding or anyone else, is just a lot more than it was just a decade or two ago. I think that's probably really different.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's just had a huge impact on how people organize, what people do with their time. I mean, just I don't know, I was watching the episode of Seinfeld the other day, and I just thought how funny it was that the whole plot was driven by the fact that Jerry couldn't go tell this girl that he wasn't going to meet her at a movie or something, right? And that whole plot doesn't even make sense today, because you just have mobile phones and everyone can just text each other all the time about changing plans. And this whole episode was about how his whole day had to be turned around in order to call a friend to go meet this person at this movie theater and tell her, okay, he can't make it, or he's going to be an hour late, or whatever it was. So I think just so many things like that as well are really different than they were just a little while ago.
Yeah, on that last point, I'm told people don't really have to make plans because they're always just in sync with everybody else. So, we had to plan things well in advance, like we're going to meet at this point and we're going to do this. But now you can just mill around and say, hey, we're all just going to do this now, and it just happens. And so that's quite different, I think. Yeah,
I mean, I think it has its pros and cons, right? I mean, the pros that maybe you can be more spontaneous, but the con is that, once you go to one event, people are very willing to sort of go to another thing because they can find out about it immediately. You can just call a ride immediately to go get there. So there's definitely maybe too much FOMO, too much fear of missing out, and that kind of makes people be a little bit less happy with what they're doing right now or who they're with right now.
I just learned the acronym FOMO from my daughter, so I didn't actually know what it meant until today.
What does it mean? I don't know.
Fear of missing out. I think there's a lot more FOMO when there's so many options available to you.
What do you feel would define your college experience? What do you think about it?
Well,
what do you imagine is really different today than it was when you went to college?
One of the things which is particularly germane to you is that there was very little action that you could take outside the curriculum or narrow career path. So in our era, if you wanted to do a PhD, then you better do well as an undergraduate in the classes so you can go to a good graduate program and get your PhD so you can become a scientist. Or you have to get into the right law school to become a lawyer, or you have to go to the medical school to go become an MD. Whereas now people can say, I'm going to start a company. I'm going to do this. I'm going to write some code by myself that millions of people are going to use.
nothing like that was really possible for anybody. Maybe the closest thing would be you wrote a really great short story and got it published in the New Yorker. But I think the set of people that were trying to do something like that was like basically zero. So almost all of us were stuck in a very rigid kind of marching pattern that you could do better or worse than somebody else in that marching pattern. And you could jump ahead. Like Corey and I think, graduated from college when we were quite young compared to our peers. But you the lane you were in was very structured. Whereas now it seems like for the very talented kids, there's just a lot more options that they could pursue. And some of those options have little to do with actually what's being taught in the courses.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of that is still the same. I mean, if you want to become a doctor, it's still the very rigid path. If you want to become a lawyer, it's still the very rigid path. And I think that there's obviously a lot of change that could happen in medical school that would make things a lot better. I mean, we have a shortage of doctors that's completely artificial by the fact that, medical schools and residency programs only want to train and admit a certain number of people, regardless of the fact that we actually need more doctors. So
the process of becoming a doctor hasn't changed that much, but the fact that there are so many options other than being a doctor or lawyer or, scientist, that I think is the thing that's different now because of the startup economy and the idea that you can be a kind of independent coder. That I think that's the part of it that's different.
Well, are we really exaggerating Steve, I think maybe exaggerating the number of career paths opened up. It seems like tech has opened up a set of career paths. People are self-starters, extremely good coders. But I'm not sure how much, the question I asked you, how outside of the tech area, how much you think things have probably changed since Steve and I were in school, where we did have this very traditional career path. Tech is new, but are there really other radically new paths that someone can take, either before college or after college?
I mean, I think you're getting at it with, your niece that you mentioned who started this catering business. I think that, the idea that maybe you can just go start the business that you want to start without getting a college degree. I mean, I think that, whether it's, start a restaurant, whether it's start a catering business, whether it's, any other number of businesses that, maybe you wouldn't get any further along, if you study, an unrelated topic. I think that's becoming more of a thing. But obviously, being in the Bay Area, being here, most of what I'm seeing is, what people in tech are doing.
You actually don't know whether people doing more startups now than there were. I think there are actually fewer small businesses started recently than there were in the past, actually. So I'm not sure what the overall trends are in this area.
That could be the post-2008 downturn, because I think a lot of people have been strapped since 2008. So there may be more startups being started, but fewer small businesses in total.
Yeah, I mean, I think a huge part of that is student loans. I mean, if someone has significant debt that they have to pay off, I mean, that's obviously going to change their risk profile and desire and willingness to start a company. I mean, that happens to people who are in med school. It happens to people in law school. Maybe their heart isn't in it anymore, or they realize, through the process that it's not for them, but they no longer have a choice. They sort of have to pay back the loans that they signed on to.
That's a huge difference that I should have mentioned, is that in our generation, nobody really ever talked about student debt. You might have a little student debt that you're kind of paying off, but it was never a really correct me if I'm wrong about this, Corey, but it was never a super onerous thing. Whereas now I get the impression that, if you graduate from college with $100,000 or $200,000 or $300,000 in student debt, it's a crushing burden that we never had to experience.
Yeah, I think that basically the cost of healthcare and the cost of education in the U.S., I think there's something like, there's an image on my Twitter that I should send you, but basically it looks at the cost of, goods by category, over the last 50 years or so. And then basically the enormous outliers are healthcare and education in the U.S. Basically the quality is constant, but the cost is exponential, and we have to do something about it, but, nothing really has happened yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think that as Peter would say in describing the higher ed bubble, he would say, well, what happened is the opportunity for the mechanism for debt financing opened up, and so the universities took advantage of that. They could raise the prices, and people would still pay them, and hence the whole enterprise became less efficient. And so, but people haven't yet been able to overcome their social conditioning that they must get a bachelor's degree, and so hence you get this bubble.
Well, the data is strong in showing how the benefits of getting college education, so people aren't deluded about this, right? compare the average lifetime income of somebody with a high school degree to someone with a college degree.
Well, but the causality is not clear, right? Because in the past, where you get all the data from, there was pretty strong ability selection for people who could graduate from college, whereas we don't have that now. If you look at typical freshman class at like a Big 10 university 30, 40 years ago, a lot of people would flunk out. That you would go to college, but then you wouldn't make it. You weren't college material, and you wouldn't graduate. And the schools didn't feel defensive about having a low graduation rate of 30 or 40% or something like that. Whereas now we're very defensive about having a graduation rate of 60 or 70%. So the signaling, I mean, the fact that college graduates in the past did well economically doesn't necessarily mean that modal kid going to college now is going to get their money's worth from their tuition in their future earnings.
Yeah,
Yes.
I mean, I think that a huge part of it is, what major did you choose? I mean, I don't think that college should be this sort of like vocational education type thing where, you're only studying something to get a job. But I mean, if you want to recoup the cost of your investment, I mean, that has to be part of it. So yeah, I mean, unfortunately, like I don't have, too many friends who are outside of tech, but the ones that I have seen, I mean, it's really difficult for them to get a job, and they sort of have to sort of like completely rethink, what it is that they wanted to do, and it's not an enviable position. And I'm not sure why they weren't counseled earlier, as freshmen, or even when they were entering school, like this is what the outcome will be 4 years from now if you pursue the path that you intend to pursue.
I think
that's irresponsible, honestly, on the part of the university or parents, I guess.
I think there's been deliberate obfuscation by professors in certain fields of the fact that the modal graduate or average graduate in that major doesn't make a lot of money. They don't want that information out there. And so they haven't tried very hard to collect the statistics and get the information out there. But I think universities as a whole have a responsibility to make sure the kid knows that future lifetime earnings are somewhat strongly dependent on choice of major. and that information should be available, but it's not even today.
Well, that data is quite public now. You can find easy websites to show you kind of modal income for different kind of majors. It's not like this is hidden. I think Glassdoor has it. I think
you're right. But it's a relatively recent thing, and I don't think the universities are supporting it that much.
That's right. Is there anything you think that someone in our generation really you'd like us to know about your generation? Right? Does that help the question at all? Is there something like, I guess there's things I wish my parents really understood about my generation. I think they didn't quite grasp. Is there things that are similar?
Sure. I mean, I think there's some things that as I'm thinking about my relationship with my parents, like the things that they don't understand. I think that the problem is I'm not sure how much of it is, just me personally, or, my peer group also feels strongly the same way. I think that me personally, I really value like traveling and new experiences, and and I think that for my parents, they see that as wandering, as being lost, as you just generally not being a good use of time. And I think them specifically as immigrants, they sort of, they came from Pakistan, and it was this very arduous process to obtain citizenship here. And obviously, I respect that was a huge gift that they gave us, and I had a great life, growing up in America versus what I would have had growing up in Pakistan. But at the same time, that doesn't diminish my desire to see the world and to experience other cultures and how other people live. And I think to them, they don't understand that. They think that, okay, America's the best country. You're so lucky that you got to be here. Why would you ever go anywhere else? So I'm not sure if that's anything that you sort of, rings a bell with you guys, but that's something that I think is really important, is like knowing how other people in the world live, and just like seeing what their day-to-day is versus what my day-to-day is here.
Well, I don't sense a huge generation gap, Corey. What do you think?
I think we talked about this a little bit, but I think in some ways, and maybe this is my own kind of self-centered view of growing up in a pretty liberal town, I think a lot of the values were viewed as kind of typically liberal and kind of maybe free to be you and me 30, 40 years ago are now completely mainstream, right? So the attitude from Amherst, Massachusetts was, of course you want to go see the world. Of course you want to get people's different perspective. And this wasn't very common, but I think, you see, and Steve, you and I have talked about the fact that some ideas kind of start small and kind of grow very, very widely. So I think mm-hmm. some of these more broad-minded ideas that I think you and I may benefit by happenstance of growing up in are now extremely common. So it's natural that, in fact, there's not going to be much generation gap between you and I and Noor, because we're actually, we're pretty much the same culture, you know, you and I and she.
Yeah, actually, that is actually what I would say as well. I think that I often hear this rhetoric around, oh, like millennials, Gen Z, or they're so different than everyone else. I think that the reality is that, you know, we're all, you know, pretty similar. I think that just go talk to someone who's, you know, 50 years older or younger than you, and I think you'll find that you'll get along more than you think. At least that was my experience, you know, coming as a 17-year-old and talking to people, you know, 30, 40 years my senior. I was just really impressed with how much they're willing to get at my level and to talk to, you know, to tell me literally that the baby steps of starting a company when they've done it, you know, 1,000 times. They funded us, you know, 1,000 companies, and they were just, you know, willing to explain things to me in that way. So I don't know. I would actually say that we're really not that different. And if anything, you know, we got our values from you guys. So we're what you wanted the world to be like. Hopefully, we're moving slightly in the direction that you expected.
I think what's interesting is that there's actually quite a lot of difference between Noor probably now and us when we were in college, right? I mean, her experience would look incredibly foreign to us 30 years ago, right? The idea of taking a gap year off I heard people did it. It seemed incredibly eccentric. Like, why would you do that? You know, you're wasting your time. Like, so us back then were very career driven. I think her idea of kind of focusing on tech, maybe taking a year off, that to me at her age would just seem like on another planet. Does it now, right? But
certainly something none of us would have thought of at that time. Now, if you have this consciousness of this whole idea that there are these things called startups, and there's a certain level, there's a certain experience and knowledge you need to execute a startup, and one of the best ways to learn that is to actually, if someone's going to pay you, like Peter Thiel, to go off and try to do one, we could conceptualize it that way, I think, but we wouldn't have even had the idea of startups. Back then, there was, you know, that was right. Just Bill Gates had just dropped out of Harvard a few years ago to start Microsoft. But the whole idea of a little tech company doing something amazing in the world was not part of our conceptual vocabulary at that time.
I think it's right.
Yeah. I mean, my parents said very much the same thing when I was deciding to do it. They just felt like, you know, this is a crazy experiment that I don't want you to be a part of. So I don't think that it's too different than the way that you guys saw it. But looking back, I don't think I made a better decision in my life. I think it totally changed my trajectory. It totally just exposed me to a world of ideas and people that are still definitely influencing me today and are some of my closest friends today.
That's great. Well, as I said, we're kind of over time, so I think we're going to call it. Noor, we really want to thank you for spending this time with us. You're obviously a very exceptional.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and it was really a lot of fun. So hopefully we can have you back on the show at some point.
Wow, that's so kind of you to extend another invitation. Yeah, it was great talking to you. I'm so glad, you know, we got the chance to meet. I mean, in some part, you know, our meeting had to do with Stanford too, right? I don't know if you would have joined me at a different school.
Yeah. Well, and next time I'm out there, we'll have to meet up again.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks again so much for having me. I really appreciated getting the chance to chat with you. All right, have a good one, guys. Thanks so much.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.